Susan, you're really clear on the American system of political economy. Nick, you may or may not be. I've got some understanding of it, and there are people watching who are like, well, what is going on? So if I could give my take and my understanding out of listening to you, Susan, and many others, and about 28 minutes ago, an interview that I did with Robert Ingrahams went live, which is he wrote a book or a pamphlet on the Promethean Action website that it's the British that killed the American presidents, pointing to evidence that suggested that it was the British behind the assassination of McKinley, Lincoln. We didn't talk about FDR, JFK, and possibly behind Trump. We don't know, possibly, but it would fit. My understanding, it goes a little bit like this. So when the Venetian bankers, when Constantinople was sacked, the Venetian bankers moved their business to Amsterdam. They lost a lot of money with the 30-year war, I think Netherlands versus Spain. And then what they did, they'd set up the Glorious Revolution in England and then moved to England near the William and Mary, the William of Orange, who became the King of England. And the Bank of England was in 1688, around about then, or just before that. 1694, the Bank of England was incorporated within the City of London that already had special status and was given more special status. And then from about 1750s to about 1910, the Bank of England was the premier central bank of the world. So Nick, there you were this Yorkshireman with a landowner, and you'd heard there's great riches to be made in Africa or Kenya or India or Australia. And rather than sell your land, you went to the Bank of England, you borrowed some gold, and then you used that gold to purchase a ship, to pay for the crew, to go to Australia or India and come back with some incredible spoils. And you were now fabulously wealthy, except you had to give the Bank of England their cut. And then they took their cut, and they did this hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times and became more and more powerful, where trillions of dollars or trillions of pounds were, I don't know, billions, lots, was passing through the Bank of England for hundreds and hundreds of years, which then allowed them to shape global politics, shape other nations' countries, deposit proxies everywhere. How come this little country of England was able to rule over South Africa, Kenya, Australia, India, for crying out, with all their population, was through the use of proxies? And they were in India for 200 years or more? So they're really deeply, deeply embedded, as they are in South Africa, as they are in Kenya. Then something happened in 1776. Those bloody honorary Americans, they said, clear off. And then England lost this incredibly valuable resource, the United States, with its labor, its resources, its land. Well, we're not having that. So we're going to do what we can to try and subvert American institutions, try and capture the government in order to wrest control. So we're in charge. And then the way that England, apart from hydrocarbons, which is resource poor, has made money is through using financial leverage as a weapon. We'll lend money to companies in South Africa, strip mine South Africa, leave most of the population poor, do the same in Sierra Leone, do the same in India, in all the other colonies, and use that money to create structures like the Federal Reserve. If prior to the Federal Reserve, the United States didn't have a central bank, like NATO. NATO was set up by the British, and the US joined later. Like the United Nations, Henry Kissinger said that he reported more often to the Foreign Office than he did to the US State Department. He was the one that appointed Klaus Schwab to head of the WEF. The MI6 trained the CIA. There's a video that's going to be coming out soon about how the British fostered Christian evangelism through promoting the Schofield Bible. So you had this notion that for Jesus to return, the Jews got to take over Israel, Greater Israel. They also fostered Wahhabism, this violent strain of Islam, in order to undermine the Ottoman Empire. They also fostered Zionism, and then they used Zionism as a control mechanism for the US polity. And the problem with JFK was that he wanted to make AIPAC register as a foreign organization. Well, you can't be having that. And then the problem with JFK and with McKinley and with Lincoln, and I understand also with FDR, I don't know, right? And Washington, I've not looked into those, but I take what you're saying as reliable, Susan, is that they wanted to set up the American system of political economy, which I think is a little bit akin to what Traore is doing in Burkina Faso, which is that our country is for us, our resources is for us. We're going to use banking to direct money in order to grow, like Traore is doing with tomato factories in Burkina Faso. We're going to have gold refineries for our gold, which we're going to dig, and we're going to use that money for the betterment of our people. Now, the problem with that, it's really, really great for the people of Burkina Faso and the problem of the the people of the United States and all the other countries that were copying this system. But how on earth is the City of London going to use financial leverage in the face of all these barriers, these protectionist barriers? And then what's happened is that the City of London, or Britain, gave nominal independence to its colonies after the Second World War, but it's running control from the shadows. So then we have the WEF, Great Reset, and the history of where it came from, the Club of Rome and all that business. I'm not too au fait with that, being used, sponsoring this global mechanism of control all over the world through lockdown and all those policies that were in place then, including by people that were captured and run by the City of London, including Obama. And one of the big tells for me about that is why MI6 was so desperate to prevent Trump getting into power that they ran Russiagate and they ran Ukrainegate and all their other mechanisms of attack against Trump. And they've done that. They do that everywhere. Any nationalist, any sovereigntist like Putin, like Imran Khan, that arises, then the MI6 controlled media through BlackRock, through Vanguard and State Street, all going back to the City of London as the bank, the central bank of all the banks. I think, and Susan, you may know more about this, but I suspect BIS came out of the Bank of England as a globalist organization so that the Bank of England can exert its regulatory rules all over, all banks all over the world. They get smeared, they get rubbished. And I am a fan of Jeremy Corbyn. I do have my criticisms of, like, climate change and the trans agenda, right? But he's a sovereigntist. He wants freedom for people in Britain to be free and to be powerful. Well, he has many of the same enemies as Donald Trump. Well, that tells me something. And he did have that novel injection. I mean, both of them did, the silly monkeys. Anyway, Susan, have I been a good student? Have I listened well to what you've been saying?
I think Bob Ingram would definitely give you an A. But just to throw a few other institutions in there, and again, I think this sort of sheds light on how this British establishment does it. Look at the post-war period. Look at the UN and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Franklin Roosevelt had a very different conception for what those institutions were to be. His idea of the United Nations was that this would be a place where sovereign nations, and he certainly hoped newly independent nations, and many of those took another 20 years to become independent from the British, Dutch, and French colonies. But his idea was this would be a place where the sovereign nations could basically gang up on the empires, and that the empires, the British, the French, the Dutch, would ultimately be put out of business. And when you think of the UN Security Council, Permanent Security Council, who's on it? Russia, Soviet Union then, China, the United States, and then France and Britain coming out of World War II. But Russia and the Soviet Union, that was actually the key to Roosevelt's conception of the post-war period, which is that basically the United States, the Soviet Union, and China would gang up on the empires. And he wanted the UN to be that. And what the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were to be was simply technical institutions to help with getting credit into hopefully newly freed countries. There's the famous interview, final summit he did with Churchill at Casablanca, where he said, "Winston, we didn't fight that war to reestablish British 18th century methods." And Churchill said, "What do you mean by that?" Because yes, we did, is basically what he was saying. And Roosevelt said, and he pointed to the map of Northern Africa where they were. They're in Casablanca. And he said, with American methods, we can, with investment, with water, with, modern equipment, we can make these countries self-sufficient. Rather than taking more out than you ever put in, which is what you were just describing, Rich. Roosevelt died. He died before the war ended. And the first person that Harry Truman called after becoming president of maybe not the first, one of the first that day was the British ambassador to the United States. And Harry Truman was essentially just a British tool. So rather than Roosevelt's intentions for the UN and the IMF and the World Bank, they became tools of British imperialism.
That does actually correspond with the piece of history that I'm familiar with around the end of the world, the end of the Second World War. The meeting in Yalta, in Crimea, formerly Ukraine, now Russia, where Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill met, and Churchill, according to all his biographers, felt iced out.
I mean, there's actually an interesting book you might want to read, Nick. I think you want to try and get the first edition because it got a little edited, written by Elliot Roosevelt, Roosevelt's son, who was with his father at all of these summits. It's called As He Saw It. And the description of the conflict, especially in Casablanca between Roosevelt and Churchill, is just, it just makes the story. It makes the case.